Okay.
I'm good. You? Welcome everybody. Let me introduce myself. I'm ethics.
I don't think yours is on.
Is it not?
Sounds good.
Is it working? No. Okay.
We're just gonna do this for the recording. Just, I know you guys can hear each other.
Not working now?
It should be.
All right. No. Okay, thank you. First of all, to some of you who know me and Jane and expected her to moderate, she's right here, but she's dealing with a little bit of laryngitis, so I'm hopping in and to do this. And I were talking about this is her first panel of authors, right? And this is my first official panel of authors. I've done other stuff, but not.
It's the hardest thing in the world.
So it is the hardest, but there's a group of five, and it's gonna be hard to contain this, right? Anyway.
So rowdy.
Right, but I thought what we'd rather do is just quickly introduce everybody and go down the line. Diane Hanks, who's coming here with her first book. Jane Healey, who is a well-known author of several books, and I've had the pleasure of hearing her on virtual. William Martin, who has been with us on several books before, so many of you know her. Marjan Kamali, who I have the pleasure of knowing because Kamali and I both are involved with Healey Library in Lexington, and you wrote your first book at Lexington Library, did you not? You did. And Krystal Marquis, am I pronouncing that right?
Marquis.
Marquis, okay, it's also her first book, so we've got some well-published people and some new people to the group, so. What we're hoping is that over this next hour or two that we're running this program, we're gonna sort of do a little bit of deep dive into historical fiction and the concept of untold stories. And hopefully by the end of the program, we'll all have a better understanding of what goes into historical fiction in these stories. And specifically our authors who have done this deep dive and probably spent a lot of time doing it. So why don't we start out with the most obvious and just quickly, I'm gonna run down the line, ask each of you to share a little bit about who you are and what your most recent book is, all right? And use the mic, thank you.
Okay, looks like it's on. I'm Diane Hanks, and this is my first book. But I've been writing for decades, mostly working on screenplays, and then Hollywood get very invested in intellectual property, so they wanted to make movies that were based on books. Because people were more familiar with them and more people were more familiar. And I decided to go back to what I had started in college, which was writing fiction. And my day job is a medical writer at the VA in Boston. And I was writing about a mental health tool called the Annie. And I looked up who this person was, why are they naming it after her, and found out that it was the first woman who'd ever earned a Purple Heart. And I had never heard of her in my life. And then I started doing some digging and could barely find out any information about her. And so I decided to dig a little, and that's what got me to write this.
Great. Surprises.
Yes.
Jane.
Hi. Thanks everyone for coming on this beautiful day. I'm Jane Healey. My first novel came out in 2017. It was a Saturday evening girls club based on the true stories of a group of women in Boston's North End at the turn of the 20th century. My second novel was Beantown Girls, which came out in 2019 based on the true stories of the Red Cross Clubmobile Girls of World War II. My third novel was The Secret Stealers, which came out in 2021 about the women of the OSS, the precursors to the CIA, also in World War II. And then my latest one came out in March, and it is biographical fiction, so a little bit of a departure. It's based on the true story of Drew Layton Tartier, who was a Hollywood actress in the 1930s and moved to Paris in 1938. She married the love of her life and ended up wrapped up in the underground network, rescuing Allied flyers and getting them out of the country during the war. I'll hand it over to Bill.
I'm Bill Martin. My first novel was called Back Bay. I have written 11 since then. Back Bay came out in 1980. I have also written an award-winning PBS documentary on the life of George Washington and a cult classic horror movie too, which you may find out more about before the day is over. My latest novel is December 41. It's a World War II thriller about a German assassin who escapes the FBI dragnet on the day after Pearl Harbor in Los Angeles and has to get himself to Washington because his job is to shoot Franklin Roosevelt on the night he lights the national Christmas tree. complications ensue.
I'm Marjan Kamali, and I'm the author of 2 novels. My first book, Together Tea, came out in 2013. It's a comedy of manners about revolution and war. It follows an Iranian mother who is so obsessed with math, she creates spreadsheets in Excel to find her daughter the perfect mate. And at the time, I thought it was a farce, and now I'm about to do that with my own daughter. So, and my second book, The Stationery Shop, came out in 2019. It is a love story set against the 1953 coup d'etat in Iran. And it follows 2 young lovers who are separated on the day they're supposed to get married, and then they reunite 60 years later in Massachusetts. My third book comes out next summer, and it's a friendship story, but it's set against the background of the women's rights movement in Iran, which has been going on for decades. Always 3 steps forward, 5 steps back.
Hello, I'm Krystal Marquis. The Davenports is my debut novel. I went to Boston College and studied biology, and I began writing on a dare and to complete the NaNoWriMo challenge. I got the idea for the Davenports after reading a Smithsonian article about C.R. Patterson. He was a man who had escaped enslavement and moved up north and started a carriage company. And it was so successful that he was able to build this wealth and privilege for his children. His son later converted it to an automobile company, and it was the first and only African-American owned automobile company in America. And I thought that was very fascinating. After doing some research, I realized that Mr. Patterson had 3 daughters, so I wondered what their lives were like. So this story is about 4 young Black women growing up in Chicago in 1910 and what their lives would have been like.
Wide genre of subjects and areas that you've been in, a little bit of World War II, also that vein. So, you know, one of the things that intrigues me as a longtime historical reader and fiction is why historical fiction? What is it that drew you? And I think a little bit you've talked about, but specifically, why did you avoid going into nonfiction history? There's a lot of you around history, or into fiction. Anyone want to pick it up for us? Anybody want to start it?
With history, you have to footnote. I don't want to do that.
I think it's the best of both worlds.
I'm gonna ask you to use the mic. We're gonna go.
Oh, yeah.
Only because it's being recorded. Thank you. And there's another mic down there.
I think with historical fiction, I think all of us probably pay a lot of attention to detail. And we probably all enjoy the research because you have to, because there's so much of it. But you also get to be creative and take a little license with your characters. I think the problem with me, and I'd be interested to know if it's a problem for anyone else, is how much liberty to take. Because I was writing about a real person, and there was nothing that I could find, very little that I could find out about her real life. So you kind of have to base the actions that I have her take in this on what I think she would do. But I didn't want to go too far, but I had to go a little bit far because it needs to be dramatic. And I wondered if other people have the same issues.
So my latest novel is biographical fiction as well, based on a real person in history. And I think I love historical fiction because history is a jumping off point, but like Bill said, you don't need to footnote, you can take creative license, but with a real person, I thought that was really like the parameters of writing about a real person in history were much more challenging than I thought it would be, because you don't, the guardrails are there, you can't veer too off course because it was, it was a real person in the past. Yeah.
I think for me, there was a difficulty finding a lot of information. There was a lot of barriers in finding what life looks like, where the old Black Wall Streets were. So a lot of my reasoning for going for historical fiction was so that I can fill in those gaps with stories from other towns or other parts of the country, and just fill in those gaps with the research that I did and combine it with different places, different experiences, and having it being inspired on actual people, but not following their lives exactly.
like I could do a lot more creative license, I could do more romance and have them push the boundaries of some of the gender and societal norms that would have been in place at that time.
Yeah, and I think for me, the epigraph to the stationery shop is a quote from Harry Truman. There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. And I feel like there's so many historical events that are embedded in our collective conscience, and everybody talks about them, writes about them, but then there are these major historical events that aren't discussed very much. But they've had huge ripple effects to this day, affecting the world really. And that's why I was really curious about the coup d'etat of 1953 in Iran, because I feel like it's led to where we are today. So part of it was just discovering the history I myself didn't know.
There's a question just to add to them, when some of you have mentioned coming across something, and particularly what you just mentioned. Do you ever have that hesitancy that if you wrote about this, it could be a problem in terms of readers? That ever? No.
For me, yes, for sure, but especially because it's always so sensitive when you write about Iran and America. And in my case, actually, I was curious to hear what Diane said, and some of you have been saying, in my case, for both books, everything had to be historically accurate. I couldn't take license. So everything was fact checked by Simon and Schuster 12 times over, because we would get into trouble if I took leeway with the history.
Bill, go ahead, you're gonna add to it.
Well, just on the whole question of, is this working?
Yeah.
The whole question of why historical fiction, well, they always tell you to write what you know when you start out as a writer. And I've never believed that. You don't write what you know, you write what you want to find out and where you want to go and who you want to meet when you get there. And as a kid, I was fascinated by so many stories from history that I saw in so many movies. And it was mostly the movies that inspired me and a few C.S. Forester novels. And so I started looking into history as a place to write my stories. History provides you always with characters you love, characters you hate, characters you love to hate. It provides you with a proscenium within which to observe human activity. And you can never say that you are out of ideas, because history also provides you with incident, whether it's that coup d'etat or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And as a writer, if you have those things to work toward, you always have a goal. And all good storytelling is about moving toward goals. It is about a sense of, for your reader and for you as a writer, a sense of getting somewhere. And if you have those historical moments that you know are out there, that your characters, whether you're approaching this as an exercise in hewing as close to history as you can, which I did in a biographical novel about George Washington called Citizen Washington, or whether you're just cutting loose and having fun with a big historical adventure. There's a novel that I wrote a long time ago called The Rising of the Moon, about Boston and Ireland in the weeks before the Easter Rebellion. No matter what you're doing, you'll always have those moments which become like signposts for you, and they become structural pieces that you can construct the rest of the novel toward. So that's another reason to write historical fiction, or as E.L. Doctorow said, the historian tells you what happened, the novelist tells you what it felt like.
Well, you took my question and did it beautifully. I was going to ask you later about tips on writing.
Yeah.
Historical fiction. But
Oh, I got a million of them.
so I imagine you do, the more you write, the more you get used to some of that. So So have all of you approached your historical fiction based on characters? I've heard a lot of you talk about characters. You picked your character, I think, picked a time. So were you dictated mostly by events or by a character? Jane, what were you, Diane, what were you dictated by?
Mine was, it was a person, but it was also a place. Because Hickam Airfield was adjacent to Pearl Harbor and got bombed at the same time. They had a lot of B-17, B-18 bombers, and I'd never heard of it. But it was the size of a small town, hundreds of people got killed. Hickam Hospital, where Annie Fox was the chief nurse, took in hundreds of patients. But yet, because Pearl Harbor, understandably, with the aircraft carriers going down, that was the focus of that day. And Hickam was kind of ignored, and is still ignored, even though, and now it's part of Pearl Harbor. I believe it's called Pearl Harbor Hickam now. So for me, it was as important to tell the story of Hickam. In fact, the screenplay was titled Hickam, as it was to tell the story of Annie Fox. So for me, it was both the place and the character.
Is there a highlight on yours for you?
Well,
You definitely World War II.
Yeah, well, with this one, I honestly didn't set out to write another World War II novel. I was kind of looking at other ideas, but Drew Layton, the character, who's a real person, her story was stranger than fiction. And I first learned about her, I was researching my last book, Secret Stealers, and I read about this incident several months after Pearl Harbor, where the Germans rounded up all these women living in and around Paris, all these American expatriates, and they rounded them up, they arrested them, a couple hundred American women. They said it was in retaliation for the the Americans arresting German women in the US, which was a lie. And they put them in a zoo. They put these 200 plus women in a zoo outside Paris. That was their first prison. And their friends and family had to pay 5 francs to like get admission and yell over the fence to them. And one of these women, there were several prominent American expatriates, but one of them was Drew Layton. And so she popped up in a couple other research sources. And after she was imprisoned by the Germans, she was imprisoned again in a camp in the mountains. And then that's when she got involved with the resistance, when she got out and started rescuing all these Allied flyers all over the country, because at the time in the war, planes were coming down. She started rescuing them and helping them get out of the country through the underground network. And those are just the highlights of her story, but it was so wild, particularly the zoo story. They were all these American women in the monkey house in the zoo. And it had these elements of comedy and tragedy with what they endured there. So her story was a jumping off point. It wasn't so much an event as much as it was true. Yeah.
And Marjan, what did you focus on? Was the intent to be the focus for you?
Actually, the character has always come first with all 3 books for me. The stationery shop, even though the backdrop of the timeline in the 50s is the coup time, I visited for my first book an assisted living center and did a reading there. And there was a gentleman, I don't know, you may have heard this story, Effie, but there was this elderly gentleman in a wheelchair who kept saying all these things to me. He kept saying he'd met the Prince of Spain, he'd traveled with Charles de Gaulle, he'd met all these world leaders, and everybody kept shushing him. They were kind of embarrassed by him ranting and raving. And I just asked him his name. And then later, when I went back home and I was talking about this event with my dad, I mentioned this man's name because he had an Iranian name. And my dad thinks he knows every Iranian American of his age. So then my father said, oh, that was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He traveled the world. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. And I realized everything this man had been saying was true, but I had not believed him. And that's what started it for me. I thought, what would it be like to be an elderly person in an assisted living center with this past that nobody believes? Or if they believe it, they don't care. And so I started with that image of this elderly man in an assisted living center. But then as I wrote it, it wasn't a diplomatic past. It was his first love from 60 years ago coming in to see him, to see what had happened at that time.
Powerful wake up, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
For me, my book is very character driven. So part of my inspiration was the daughters of Mr. Patterson. So the characters in my book are 4 young women looking for love, but they also have their parents planning out their futures for them. They are trying to make marriage matches. They're trying to get them in a position where they can continue the wealth that they've acquired in this generation, something that was very rare in the early 1900s. So their struggle of, do I follow the path that my parents have laid out for me, or do I follow my own dreams or pursue my own passions, was really at the core of my story.
Good. Anybody else want to make a comment? Because I was gonna ask this, but good.
No, go ahead.
Because, so you made a reference very early on, and all of you have to your research, right? And it obviously you have to do that if you're gonna get into historical novels and how difficult it is. Would you share a little bit about what the highlights, where do you go to do your research? And sometimes what happens when you hit a wall in research? And I also know that research is endless. So do you have sort of kind of some tips that you might share with our audience and to each other, where do you draw a line? Where do you say this is not, even though I'll save it for another book?
For me, I went to the library. So I started my book just before the pandemic. So I went to my public library. I met with the patrons there, and with the librarian there, she helped me pull different books after I read this article. And there was one book that had a list of prominent African-American figures and their contributions to society and history. So during that time period, I wrote down their names so that I can look for it later. And then when the pandemic hit, everything had to go virtual. And I knew my story was going to be set in Chicago based on a lot of the research that I had found. It seemed like it was very much a hub of change and progress. So I went to the Chicago Public Library, and they have archives and maps and floor plans for hotels and everything that I needed right there available. So for me, that was the big source of research for me for my book, was using that library system and being able to read the digital copies and the primary resources that they made available when everything had to shut down. And things that I couldn't find, that became the fiction, and the romance is part of the fiction. So yeah, that's where.
That's the literary license piece of it.
So, I think the biggest change that I did for my story was for the Great Migration. Even though it started in 1910, it peaked between 1920 and 1940. But one of the main characters of my book, Olivia, she lives a sheltered, privileged life, and she meets this young gentleman who's part of the civil rights movement, and he's from the South. And he's telling her about Jim Crow and all these laws that are being passed. So the influx of people moving into Chicago, I moved that up a decade just so that it could help push her awakening as to the changes that are going outside this protected bubble that her parents had created for her.
I was on a panel a couple of years ago at the Historical Novel Society conference, and one of the other authors on the panel, when we were talking about historical research and balancing fact versus fiction, said something that I still think about, like, your author's note is your best friend, like your historical note at the end as a writer is your best friend, because that's where you can explain to people, like, here's where I took liberties, here's where I stuck to the facts. So yeah, I mean, I think with every book, it's a balancing act. And I always ask myself, like, if this particular event didn't happen, could it have happened within the time and place contextually? Like, does it make sense? Does it feel authentic and organic to the time and place?
That's great.
I like to keep them guessing. I don't give them an author's note at the end, usually. The best way, the first rule of research is only write novels in which the research is fun. I made this decision when I was working on my second novel, which was about organ transplantation, and the character gets a kidney transplant and becomes fascinated by the donor and so forth and so on. And I was in an operating room about to watch my first kidney transplant. And I said, I'm never going to research another novel in a place like this. So for the next book, which was the one about Ireland and the three-masted schooner voyage across the Atlantic, I got to sail on a three-masted schooner off the coast of Maine. I wrote a novel about the history of the Navy. And for that one, went to Pearl Harbor. sailed on the USS America, the aircraft carrier, sailed on the nuclear submarine, actually got launched off of the aircraft carrier, all in the service of the novel. And with almost every one of the books, there's been something good and exciting that's happened out in the real world, where you can go and see, for example, if you're writing about the Battle of Gettysburg, you can see the battlefield. And while there are no soldiers out there now, the ghosts are still there, and the light falls in the same way. And it's true whether you're on a well-preserved place like Gettysburg, or if you're walking the streets of a modern city. So you try to do as much of that kind of on-site research as possible. You also begin your reading research a mile wide and an inch deep. You read the books that are the essential subject, the essential seminal works about your subject matter. I bet you read The Warmth of Other Suns, yes, which is by Isabel Wilkerson. That's a book about the Great Migration. After that, though, you have to start boring holes down into the research. You have to start answering very specific questions. And one of the best places to do that is in newspapers, in order to capture the texture of the world that you're writing about. For example, I can tell you what was on the menu at the Dolphin Restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue in April of 1865, because there's an ad. And I was writing about that week in Lincoln's life. And I read every newspaper for the month of April, 1865. And she crab soup cost $1.25. That's in the book. I can also tell you that there was actually an ad in the Washington Daily Republican for Our American Cousin. Show ends on Friday night. Well, it sure did. Not quite the way that they thought that it would. That, of course, was the play that Lincoln was watching when John Wilkes Booth got to him. And with my new book, December 41, like you, I was, and all of us, I guess, I was locked up in the house as a result of COVID, and so did not get to wander around Washington, D.C. and justify staying in the Willard Hotel for a few nights like the characters do, and writing it off. And the middle of the book takes place on the Santa Fe Super Chief crossing America. And we thought about writing Amtrak from Los Angeles to Chicago, but that didn't seem too appealing. We did, however, find completely restored at the Sacramento Railroad Museum the actual dining car that was in that train, and in which I write half a dozen scenes in the book. And so I went around, took all the pictures I could, and among the pictures was that menu. So when you read the menu in the book as to what they were eating and drinking on the Santa Fe Super Chief.
That helps, Bill, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's an appreciation for that. Good.
They did have steak with like large sauce.
They did, yes. That's all straight
I
up.
knew, I figured that it was.
Yeah,
I
it's
couldn't
lard
have made this up.
larded tenderloin of beef.
Yeah.
And
Right, so on your research, I have an interesting question as a reader of a long
Yeah.
time, because I think, Jen, you mentioned it, you do have author's notes, and some of you do have author's notes. And I know as a reader, I find it helpful. And I just finished one that had no author notes, and I was trying to think, okay, what was real here and what was not? And to me, it was both up and down. So why do you decide to put author notes in and Bill does not? This couple of things.
Oh.
Or I
There you go.
anyway.
I found after my first novel, Saturday Evening Girls Club, I do a lot of reader events, and people really enjoyed them. They like to know like what was real, what was not, and I still get emails all the time for my different books, and people say, I'm so glad you shared this. I didn't know about that spoiler. I didn't know she was a real person until the note. I won't even give away anything for that, but yeah, I think I just like to share that my research in that way too, because oftentimes I think we all know, like, you do tons of research and maybe like 10% of it gets into the book, and then so you can share some extra in the author's notes at the end too.
Is that kind of frustrating for some of you? You do all this research and you got a ton of it, and I'm thinking piles in your phone and boards all over the place. Is that the most frustrating part of doing historical fiction, when you have to let go of all that stuff?
Well, I think a good rule of thumb is that whole iceberg theory, not just for research, but just for even the writing of the drafts. You know, you do all this work and then it's sort of the top 20% that may end up in the finished book. But having done the other 80% only helps the work, only makes the characters more credible, only makes your voice more credible. And just one thing I'll add, I agree with what everyone said about the research. Just one other thing, in addition to reading all the nonfiction sources, the newspapers, going to the library, is maybe if you have the privilege of interviewing people who live through it. So for the coup, I interviewed every person I could get my hands on who'd lived through it. And so many of them didn't want to talk about it. They kept trying to change the topic of my novel. They were like, why don't you just write about Australia? You know, and then I could tell they were holding back. But then a few opened up, and then when they opened up, you know, I got so many great details down to, you know, the exact time that the music on the radio changed, because the mob had climbed into the prime minister's home and there was suddenly a new government in power that afternoon. So I think if you have the privilege of interviewing people, that's also a great resource. And also looking at old magazines, I looked at old Life magazines of that time, and, you know, just the photographs sparked so much too.
So I have a couple of questions. These are just kind of fun ones a little bit, but before I ask that, I do have one thing. Is there a definition for historical fiction? And, you know, you talk about literary, you know, taking literary license or putting a lot in, but in the field of by your publisher, your agent, does anybody say to you what you do have to include to be identified as a historical fiction writer? I don't see it, that's why I'm curious.
Historical novel is long form prose fiction in which the author never lets the facts get in the way of a good story. That's my definition.
You know, my first book, I didn't intend for it to be historical fiction. It was a shock to me that it was classified as such, because it took place in the late 70s and the mid 90s. And I guess the historical event around which some things were based was the 1979 revolution in Iran. And I later, after it was published, learned that it's historical fiction. And I said, that's not history. And then the 22-year-old editorial assistant said, oh, it is. So, you know, sometimes you're not even intentionally writing historical fiction.
Anyway, so anyways, let's jump a little bit to your style and the way you like to write or how you write, because I think it's always intriguing when you listen, especially during COVID, when so many people said, so many authors, as you had children in the background, driving away, couldn't go someplace that was quiet. So Mina introduced me to a couple of terms, and that's the plotter and the pantser, the sort of person who goes by the seat of the pants, or the person who writes detail after detail and years to do it. So would you define yourself, Diane, as either of those or something else?
I don't hem and haw. When I sit down at the laptop, I can write. But in between that, there's a lot of, you know, research and reading, and with this book, I was helped a lot by the US government, because there was so much investigation of why we got caught with our pants at Pearl Harbor. So there was a lot of information to read about, and there were interviews, like you were saying, that were done then about people who were involved in it. So there were a lot of firsthand accounts to go through. But I am more of a prancer, I think. I get it just comes. Yeah.
And I am the opposite. No, and I love this question because I have a historical happy hour podcast. I ask every author that's on about it, and every answer is different. There's no wrong way to do this as long as you get the book done. But I am very much a plotter. I like to have a roadmap. So I'm working on a new project now, and I'm before I even really dig into just writing the first page, I start mapping it out chapter by chapter, scene by scene, event by event. And I definitely pivot along the way for sure, but I like to have something in front of me that kind of tells me where I'm going.
Well, I have my screenplay in front of me. That's that's not a good change. And screenplays, come kind of easily to me because I've been doing them for so long, but that is a very detailed outline. I mean, it's 115, 120 pages. And then you've got to go 200 plus more.
Yeah.
But that's the fun part. It's like, well, now I get to do this, now I get to do that.
Filling in the blanks.
Yeah, filling in the blanks and just decomposing. When you write a screenplay, you're just thinking, okay, I don't want to go too much on what they're wearing because the costume designer does that. The director's going to do that. The actor's going to do that. So you always have to keep all those other people in mind. But when you're writing a novel, you get to be all those people. So it's just more fun.
What was your approach, Krystal, on the first book, on your first debut?
Mine?
That's in Krystal.
Oh,
Okay, we'll come back.
For me, this one was very heavily plotted. So I had chapter by chapter, 2 to 3 sentences about major events that I wanted to happen in the story. Each chapter is told from a different perspective of the 4 girls. So I had to make sure that where one chapter ended, the next girl from her perspective could pick up the story and move it along. For other things that I've written, by the seat of my pants, like making it up as I go along. But this one was very much, I had a good idea of where I was going. I did at one point rewrite the whole middle of the story because I didn't really like the way the characters were interacting, so I changed it up. Ruby, who is Olivia's best friend, was a rival to her, and I didn't like that catty interaction between 2 young girls. So I rewrote it and they were best friends in the current version. So that took a lot of reworking some of the scenes and some of the story and just how the ending would play out. But I still had that outline as a roadmap to keep me going, yeah.
Before we go any further with some of our questions, is there anybody in the audience that has a question that you'd like to share? Okay, let me give you a microphone and let me bring the microphone down.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Let me get up. Hi, thanks for being here, guys. I'm so excited. First person or third and why?
What was the question again?
Do you work in first person or third and why?
Get the mic, go and take that.
All of the above. I mean, you can, the question that she's asking, first person or third and why, has about 1 million answers. It's basically, am I going to write this story through the point of view of a single narrator? Am I going to write this story through the point of view of an omniscient narrator who is in everybody's head? Am I going to write this story through the point of view of a omniscient narrator who is in selected heads in each individual scene? Am I going to, I mean, we can just keep, that's okay. We can, because it's an, if you want to understand the process of writing and how you begin to make the myriad of decisions that you have to make in every single scene. The first place that you have to look is to point of view. How am I going to tell the story? My son just, actually they released it yesterday on PlayStation. Get it for these 2 guys. These 2 guys have been sitting here so patiently right here. Both of them deserve to play Star Trek Resurgence, which my son just wrote. Yeah, right. And he is writing, he wrote 1,400 pages worth of what amounts to screenplay material, Star Trek screenplay material. And the reason he wrote so much was because each character that is set up as one of the characters that the game player can play has their own reality. And as a result, every time they make a decision in the game, it presents the player with 4 more decisions to make in order to keep the story rolling. So that there is this, rather than having a straight line to the story, there is this strange looking capillary system that is entirely a result of the decision that the player makes to play this character or to play that character. And all of us have to make that decision every day as we write. And so I've made it a lot.
I good.
Can I just ask him, I'm familiar with the book, the December 41, the time period.
Yeah.
Why did you choose first person or third for that specific novel, and why?
That one is a limited omniscient. December 41 is a limited omniscient point of view. Because I knew that I wanted to have 5 characters whose lives are intersecting, and I wanted to be able to get in and out of the heads of all of them and show you where all of them are almost simultaneously in the story. With other novels, the novel before that, the whole historical section was entirely first person. It was a journal. And that was really interesting to write. And prior novels worked in other ways, but you know, you make that decision pretty early on. And if you mess it up, you might have to go back and change things. Yeah.
That answer your question? Anybody else have a question before we wrap up? Okay, let me take them right down. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, for like Andy Fox, the Clubmobile Girls, Mr. Patterson, these little pieces or people that are part of the past that history completely forgot about. Did you go looking for them? Did they come to you and you said, hey, wow, I can make a story out of this? Or, you know, how do you find these little forgotten bits?
So with the Clubmobile Girls, I came across a photo of these 4 women in a field on Pinterest actually, and it said Red Cross Clubmobile Girls, England, 1944. And that kind of sent me, I didn't know Clubmobile is not a real word. I was like, who are these girls? What do they do? And I went to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, which is a great library for women's history. And they had 13 boxes of diaries and letters and like notes about how to make the donuts and pictures, and they had let me try on the uniform, and those diaries and letters. I mean, letter writing is such a lost art. Like those, they gave me my characters. You know, a lot of the letters were from the women in the European Theater of Operations, and so the main characters in the book, Fiona, Viv, and Dottie, are really composites of a lot of the different women I read about in the letters and diaries of the Schlesinger. That was like my main, because primary source materials like that and research is so huge, and that's what they really, those letters gave me my story.
I think for me, the article about Mr. Patterson found me. It was sent to me by a friend. They know that I like cars. I have a 2006 Mustang that my dad and I tinker with. So they saw this article about a young gentleman and standing in front of an automobile. He had a 3-piece suit and a top hat, and it talked about his father, C.R. Patterson, and how he converted the company to an automobile company. And just about the history that, like you said, was forgotten, that people don't really talk about. And that kind of just opened up a little bit of a rabbit hole that I fell into, just trying to find more information about it, because it wasn't something that I had learned. It wasn't something that was talked about really in my classes. And it was around the same time where more people were talking about Black entrepreneurs from the early 1900s, like Madam C.J. Walker, who inspired another one of the characters in my story. So it's this young woman who created a hair care line and became a millionaire and bought a house next to Rockefeller. So I thought that was really interesting.
We're gonna try to wrap up a little bit. Before I do, and I know we're gonna have some discussions and breakouts, so you'll be able to ask a lot more questions. But do any one of you have a real hot question you have for each other?
Marjan, what's going on with the movie? And you need to share, because it's very exciting.
Well, as you all know, there was a writer's strike, so everything's on hold. The stationery shop was optioned actually for TV series.
TV series, sorry.
TV series. So it was super exciting, but the writer's strike held things back a bit, and then also Discovery and Warner Brothers merged and bought HBO. So HBO is in like some pause. So long story short, we have the script, we have all these actors who are ready to go, but we are currently on hold. But more soon, hopefully.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Yes.
So excited.
We're gonna be there.
Yeah.
So I'd like to wrap up. You're gonna have some time to do this. I think because we're gonna go on to some other things here. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to know, did you actually write this in a month? With that
No,
November,
that's not-
No, I didn't. I wrote about the first 20,000 words during NaNoWriMo. So for those who don't know, November is National Novel Writing Month, and there is an organization that raises money to fund education programs for children, and you pledge to write 50,000 words of a novel within that 30 days of November. I did the proposal part of this novel during that month. So I got the first 20,000 words of the Davenports written during the 2019 NaNoWriMo challenge.
that's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
So I'd like to wrap up by combining a couple of questions, and I think it may be a little bit hard. Being somebody who has lots of books on the side, I can only imagine how many books you have piled up or people have asked you to read and stuff, but among that pile, so here's the first question, among the pile that you have by your bedside, is there a book that you're looking forward to reading or you're reading now? And what's in the pipeline along with the movie, for yourself? You want to start? Go ahead.
I'm currently reading Lessons in Chemistry, and I have to admit that the first 80 pages, it just didn't grab me, and I just stayed with it, and now I love it. And I think it was because I had read The Quiet Tenant right before, and that it was just such a different book. And wasn't as lighthearted, I would say. But that's what I'm reading now.
I loved it.
Yeah.
I just finished The Spectacular by Fiona Davis. Yeah, about a rocket and historical fiction about a rocket in the 1950s and a bomber in New York City. I don't know, there was this bomber that was going around New York City bombing these major sites, and it's excellent. She's such a great writer. Yeah.
I'm currently reading this one.
Well done.
Since we're going to be in conversation at Titcomb's in Sandwich on November 7th, you're all available. Come on down. And I'm also reading a novel from some years back, which is about the same subject that I'm writing now, which is Russian espionage surrounding Los Alamos. And that book got really well reviewed, and I know I can do a better job, so.
I usually have two piles. I'm sure my fellow authors can relate to this. There's the books you're sent to blurb. So the blurb is, the praise on the back of the book. That's done by fellow authors. So you get sent these manuscripts, and I'm currently running behind on that. But once I'm caught up, I want to read Greenwild, which is actually a middle grade novel that my cousin wrote during the pandemic. She's 30 years old, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller list since it came out. I'm super proud of her. It's a fantasy about like a garden, like a secret, modern day secret garden, middle grade novel. Yeah, can't wait to read it.
Oh, like you, I'm also reading books to blurb. I have two. One is the Jane Eyre retelling, which I'm really enjoying. For personal entertainment, I'm reading Nightbirds by Kate J. Armstrong. It's set in London in 1920 and is about these young women who live in a boarding house, and they all have magical powers. So it's pretty interesting.
So Chris, I'm gonna have you hold on to the mic and just, we're gonna go back down and ask everybody, what are you working on now? Or what are your plans coming up? Are you-
Oh, so I'm working on the sequel to the Davenports right now. It's called More Than This and it's coming out next summer.
Yeah, I am going through the final proofs for the next novel, which is called The Lion Women of Tehran and comes out next summer too. And so it's that weird stage where I'm not writing anything new, but just sort of copy, checking all the punctuation and all that in the final proofs.
I'm looking for more research adventures. The novel is called Chain Reaction, and it'll be out after I've finished it. And I haven't even worried about that too much lately, because it's been fun in my boat most of the summer, chasing bluefish. And when I'm done with it, you'll all be the first to know.
I hope you caught a couple of those, because they're pretty good.
Yes, I did.
I'm currently on submission, so my editor has 2 projects I submitted. The way it works, I have to submit like the first 30 pages of projects, so that neither of the books are written. And I'm waiting to hear if they give me the green light to move ahead. I'm superstitious. It's not World War II. That's all I can say.
A little nervous moment.
Yeah, totally. Like, yeah. So we'll see what happens.
I'm also in a kind of holding position. I finished, I wrote 2 more novels and I'm waiting to get the green light. They're done. So I'm just waiting for a yes or no. And one is World War I and one is the Great Depression, the time setting. But I also don't want to get into too much. I think that's jinx.
Well, I want, on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you very much. It's been a delight to have such a distinguished group and so much content and different and yet together on so many different things. So we're going to take a break here. I'm going to thank our audience, and there's going to be some book signing and I think a little bit more discussion. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you guys want to take a quick break, or do you? Wait 1 second. Let me just turn this off.
Let me stretch a little bit.